topic is on mindset and mentality. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you are new today or you weren't on the first session, we will have a Q&A portion at the end. And there is a little box at the bottom of your screen that you can send in questions, and then we'll have a moderator at the end read them out, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible for you guys. And secondly, we're going to switch things up a little bit this week, and we're going to have our guest speaker speak to everyone first instead of last. So I'd like to welcome Dave Poulin on. Dave, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mike. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and Dave, for those of you that don't know him, I'm sure most of you do, but he's going to be a great guest for us. Just to give a little background on his story, he'll go into more depth about it as we get going here. But Dave played at Notre Dame, ended up going to the NHL, playing over 700 games, was the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers. And then once he was done playing and had an extremely successful NHL career, he transitioned into coaching. He did some scouting, he did some management, and then transitioned over to the media side of things. And he's currently doing some TV, and now he's starting writing as well. So he's a guy that's done pretty much absolutely everything you can think of when it comes to the game of hockey. And so he'll be a great guest for us today. And I specifically chose him for today's topic of mindset and mentality. He probably could have been a guest on any one of our topics with the amount of experience he has, but specifically chose him for this topic because of how unique his story is. And that's the first question I have for Dave. So Dave, talking about a little bit about your unique path, and we're going to get into it when the slideshow starts about how everyone has different paths in hockey, but yours was definitely a unique one. Can you kind of take us through why it was unique and leading up to making the NHL? What was your path and why was it so unique?
Well, thanks, Mike. And I will certainly, talk about the uniqueness of it. We're all writing our own story. That's what you're doing right now. You're writing your hockey story. We've got a full range of ages on here. The youngest might be 6 or 7 years old. The oldest might be, late teens. But you're writing your hockey story and your mind with you because it's a crazy, crazy story. And when I do, you're gonna look at it and go, "Oh, how does that all work?" But the story that you're going to tell in your future, be it 10 years from now or 20 years from now, whatever you've done in the game of hockey, you're going to look at this year, the pandemic year, as the crazy year, and it's going to work into your story somehow. So first of all, I'm a Timmins guy. I was born in Timmins, and I didn't play organized hockey up there, and I was a figure skater. So I started skating probably because I had an older sister who was figure skating, and it was just easier to drop 2 kids off at the rink than 1. So I was on skates from probably the age of 2.5 and was a pretty good figure skater apparently, and moved to Toronto almost 9 years old before I played organized hockey. And I played house league in the West End of Mississauga. And then it was about when I was 13 years old that I started playing in the MTHL, and then it was BAAA. So I started in Rep B, and we had one line. Steve Craig and Eddie Howell and myself was the line, and we stayed together. We moved from Rep B to Rep A to Rep AA, which was the highest level. And we were a really good line. And by the way, now I'm 13, 14 years old, was one of the smallest kids in MTHL in the city of Toronto. I mean, I was tiny. And every year I would go back to try out and they'd say, "Well, you did really well, as a 13-year-old, but you're not big enough to play minor bantam." And I'd be the last one to make the team. And then I'd lead the league in scoring. And then the next year I'd deal with the same thing again. And so when I was almost 16 years old, I actually, I was basically tired of being told I couldn't do it. And I went back and played house league for a year and a half. And so now I'm, late 16, early 17 years old, and halfway through the year, got an opportunity to come back and play juvenile AAA. That's where I started my road back. And through that year and a half, when I went back and played house league, my dad still came to every game. He never pushed, and it was fun again. And I really enjoyed playing. I was playing with my buddies for a team in Arundel. But then got kind of the burning desire to go back. And now it's, in development wise, it's late. So I went back, I played half a year at juvenile, and then the next year tried out for the Dixie Beehives, which was a tier 2 junior A team. In the back of my mind, I always wanted to get a college scholarship. That was what I wanted to do. It wasn't about playing in the NHL. And I was a really good student, and I just kept going. And so even at the start of that year of junior, I didn't make the tier 2 junior team. I made the junior B team. But every game I was getting called up to play for the tier 2 junior A team. And it was the Dixie Beehives in the great Dixie Arena Gardens, which was probably a little smaller than your garage, the tiniest rink you've ever seen. And so now the scholarship thing came into play because I'd been called up full time to play tier 2 junior A. And the player beside me in the locker room, a kid named Billy Shutt, and Billy got a letter one day from Notre Dame, and it had the big gold ND in the corner. And, I said to him, what are you doing with that? And he said, no, I'm going to Michigan State. And I said, can I have your letter? And he said, sure. So he gave me his letter, and I sent a nice letter to the University of Notre Dame. And I said, thank you for your interest in me as a hockey player. Of course, they had no idea who I was, and filled out the information sheet. But on that information sheet were the grades, and I had very good grades, and I was playing tier 2 junior hockey in Canada. And so the call came, and as soon as you got that first call back then, it was a big deal. And so now when other schools would call, because they were all interested in Billy because he was such a great defenseman and he was a straight A student. And so from that tier 2 team, 11 players ended up going to the States on scholarships of some form, basically because of Billy. And so once it started for me on the recruiting trail, it snowballs because, then when Cornell would call or Harvard would call and they'd say, who are you talking to? And I'd say, well, I'm talking to Notre Dame, and then it built. And so I started the process, and I tell people all the time, if you're interested, you've got to tell them. And with all the information available now, online, everything else, you can go on websites, you can look at anything you want to. And so I narrowed it down, and I chose 6 schools, 3 in the East and 3 in the Midwest. So it was Michigan, Michigan State, and Notre Dame, and Cornell, Clarkson, and Boston University. Those are the 6 schools that I chose to visit. I went on my visit first to Notre Dame. And I remember walking on campus. It was the first time I'd ever been on a US college campus. And I just thought, this is magnificent. This is everything I want. And it was a great school. And it had a good hockey program, not a great hockey program back then. And I actually called my dad that day and said, I'm coming here. Like, I'm telling them I'm coming. And he said, well, what about the 5 other schools? And I said, Dad, this is a great school. It's the highest rated academic school that I've got. And I'm coming here. And I didn't go on the other 5 visits. I saw something I loved, and it wasn't about pro hockey. It was about getting a great education. And I actually remember going into my high school guidance counselor. I played for a club team, as most of you do. I didn't play for a school team. No one at my high school even knew I was an athlete. And I remember going into my high school guidance counselor, and I had this big stack of letters, like 25 or 30 schools. And it was Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Boston University, Cornell, Clarkson, all these great schools. And he looked at me and he said, well, what are these? And I said, well, I can go to any of these schools I want to. And it was a really proud moment for me because it was because of my academics that I could go there. It wasn't, yes, I was a good hockey player, but, and I had started to grow. And so everything was clicking in at the right time. And when I went to Notre Dame, I had a great freshman year. I was one of the top scorer on the team and one of the top scorers in the country. But then at the start of my second year, I got really sick, and I got a disease called meningitis, and it really set me back for my second and third years. So if you look at my college scoring stats, you see this monster first year, and then it steps back during my second and third years, and then a monster fourth year. But the reason I say that is, there was a lot of talk after my first year about the NHL. For the first time, there was a lot of talk. I had been undrafted, but then getting sick made me realize that, this is about getting a great education. This is about school. This is how fast something can happen and go the other way. And so I had no intentions of ever leaving school early. I graduated, after 4 years with a degree in business, marketing, and finance. And during my senior year, I had heard from some NHL teams about potentially an amateur tryout offer at the time, about coming in spring break during my senior year. But I was just, I was going to graduate university, and I accepted a job my senior year with a company called Procter & Gamble. And so graduating in May, I was going to work selling bar soap and laundry products. It was a great job, international program. And that's what I was going to do. So now I've graduated university, and I get a call through a connection, one of the other college coaches, and it's from a coach who's coaching in Sweden. And he said, look, I understand you're not going to play pro next year. And would you be interested in playing in Europe? And so I talked to the company I had taken a job with, and I said, what do you think? And they said, well, yeah, we want you in international sales. Go to Europe for a year. So once again, I did not go to Europe to get to the NHL at all. I went to Europe to further my life experiences. And one theme here that I will stress to you, I think the most important skill I ever had was the ability to keep going. It wasn't skating, or it wasn't stick handling, or it wasn't passing, it wasn't anything hockey related. It was the ability to keep going. I just kept going. And when I got to Europe and Sweden, I played for a Division 1 team, not in the highest series, but a Division 1 team called Rogla BK, and everything clicked for me. So, I was 23 years old, and everything fell into place perfectly. I had good line mates. I developed my individual game. I led the league in scoring. And about Christmas time, I started hearing that there were NHL teams interested in me. And so, coming back from Europe, once again, the crazy story continues. I had an opportunity to go to Portland, Maine, which was the farm club of the Philadelphia Flyers, and play for their American Hockey League team just on an amateur tryout offer. So I didn't sign a contract. And when I got there, I was a new kid coming in from nowhere in late January. Well, actually, late February. It was, so the season was almost over. And once again, everything clicked for me. I had good line mates, good teammates, and I tore up the American Hockey League, 16 games. And now I was sitting in a little restaurant called Duffy's Pancake House. And it was April Fool's Day when I got called up to the NHL. Like, when that phone rings on April Fool's Day, you're like, there's no way this is a real call. And I got called up. It was a Friday morning, and they said, you're going to play tomorrow night for the Philadelphia Flyers in Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, a building I had grown up going to games to. I was a Leaf fan growing up. But they said, but we want you to play tonight in the American League. And so I had to play one more game in the American League, knowing I was going to the NHL. And the next morning, woke up early in New York, flew to Toronto, and walked into Maple Leaf Gardens with my bag over my shoulder, my sticks. I hadn't met one player on the team. I went through the front door. I didn't even know there was a player entrance. And I asked an usher, hey, can you help me find the locker room? And he's looking at me like, who are you? And I said, well, actually, I'm going to play for the Philadelphia Flyers tonight. And it was a dream. It was a whirlwind. It happened all, it was a crazy, crazy story. And that first game, my first shift, we took a penalty of the game, which for the Philadelphia Flyers back then was, pretty common. And the coach behind me, who I didn't even know, Bob McCammon, said, well, let's see if you can play, kid. Go and kill the penalty. So my first shift was shorthanded, which was probably fitting. And then my second shift in the NHL, Daryl Sittler was playing for the Philadelphia Flyers. And he was a great, great, great Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the best Leaf players in history. And he got the puck and threw it across. And on my first shot in the NHL, I went crossbar and down for my first goal. I scored a shorthanded goal in the second period and never looked back. And actually led the team in scoring during the playoffs. We got knocked out early by the New York Rangers. And then that, you know, think of what's happened in the last calendar year. I've graduated from college. I got married. I went to Europe. I played 16 games in Portland, Maine in the American Hockey League. And now I had played 5 games in the NHL, 2 regular season games and 3 playoff games. And, you know, and so then, Mike, I'll let you jump back in here, because that is the point that triggered my first article as a writer.
Yeah, and that was one of the, well, first of all, that's an unbelievable story. It's almost like you went through and saw my slideshow and basically took every slide and lesson that we're going to talk about here and put it into your story, which is awesome. But yeah, that was the other reason why I thought you would be a great guest for this topic today, is because I read that article and it was after your 2-goal game, your first game. And for most people, you know, going into that summer, you know, most people your age would look at it and go, you know what, I've arrived. I got 2 goals. I'm the man. The NHL isn't that hard. I'm going to play for 15 years. And you almost did the opposite, really. And our topic of mindset and mentality is that it made me think of that, because you did something, and I'll let you explain it, but you did something that summer, or at the start of that summer, that basically, I don't want to say tricked your mind into it, but gave you a constant reminder of what you were up against, and was probably a huge part of getting to stick in the NHL, you know, even though you had the big 2-goal game and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. So can you go over that story quickly, please?
Yeah, it really was, Mike. So right around that time, I'm an avid reader. I've always been an avid reader. And anytime I'm reading a book, I try and take, it doesn't matter what type of book it is. It can be a fiction book. It can be another sports book, it can be a business book. I try and take stories from the book and see how it applies to my life. So I was reading a great baseball book by a writer named Roger Angel. And I read a quote, and it was about a player who came up to the major leagues. And his first month in the major leagues, he was named player of the month. And he hit home runs and he stole bases and he was just great every single night. And then he sort of faded away and he was never heard from again. And the quote was, "To some, the best comes first, a miserable arrangement." And I cut that quote out of that book and I carried it in my wallet for the next 12 plus years, because hey, I'd scored 2 goals in my first NHL game. I had led the team in scoring in the playoffs. What was going to happen? It was right at that time. And I took that quote. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. Was I really an NHL player? Like, was this all real? Was it a dream? And every day, and then I got a real break in that, you know, the Hall of Famer Bobby Clark, right at that same time, invited me to work out with him that summer. He asked me what I was doing, and I said, "Look, Mr. Clark, I have no idea what I'm doing." And he said, "Well, if you want to move to Philadelphia and spend the summer here, sublet an apartment from one of your teammates, you can work out with me in the mornings." So the mornings were 6 days a week at 7 a.m. And we were 2.5 hours in the gym. And this was 1983, long before, you know, this was fashionable. And 2.5 hours in the gym. Then we ran 5 miles Monday through Friday and 8 miles on Saturday. And so there's mornings when I'm like, am I getting up at, 6 o'clock in the morning every morning? I thought I'd made it in the NHL. And I would keep pulling out my wallet, Mike, and looking at that little quote. And I wasn't going to let that be me. And then I had a great rookie year in the NHL. I had 75 points, 30 goals my rookie year. And, teamed up with a couple of great line mates in Brian Propp and Tim Kerr. But once again, it's not like it was just this golden path. I mean, things kept happening, and no matter what happened, if you didn't feel like going to the gym, if it was really tough, I pulled out that quote and I read it. And I just said, this is not going to be me. And so the significance of it years later, when I wrote my first article, now I get approached and I get asked to write articles for the Toronto Star. And I'm like, well, I'm not a writer. What does that mean? I don't know how to write articles. But I thought about that quote, and I've done a lot of different things in my life in the great game of hockey. And when I start something new, I think about that quote, because if I start well, then I want to get better. And I became known as an absolute gym rat. Each year I wanted to win the best conditioned athlete, going into training camp. And so even before the year started, I had that goal. And so it sounds funny that something that simple would motivate you, but I still think of that quote to this day. Whenever I'm doing something new and it goes well at first, I think about that quote.
Yeah, it's a great lesson for everyone on the call, no matter what age or level you're at. And your story being so unique is also a great lesson, I think, for everyone on the call. We'll get you out of here on one more quick question here. After playing, you've gotten into the coaching I mentioned, management, scouting, and now the media stuff as well, TV, writing. So you've done a lot of things outside of playing the game. And the realistic nature is that every kid on this call isn't going to play in the NHL. Some of you guys might, but there's tons of great ways to stay involved in the game of hockey, whether it is media or it's coaching or it's being a referee or an agent. So can you just speak on quickly on some of your experiences outside of actually playing the game, and how that's kind of shaped your life and how important that's been, and how fun that's been for you to stay involved in the game, but in kind of different areas of it?
Well, it's been so great for me, Mike. And really, I actually tried to get away from it at various points. I had no intentions of coaching at all, none, when I was playing. And while I played, so years 2 through 9, I worked in the summer on Wall Street, and I got my licenses as a stockbroker. And it was something that, had I not done it then, I probably would have done it when I was done playing. But it sort of, I did it for a big company, and then I broke off and opened a small broker dealer. So I tried different things, but I kept coming back to hockey. And Notre Dame called me and asked me to come back and coach. I did that for 10 years. I worked as an athletics director for a couple of years. And then I totally stepped away from the game into private industry in Chicago. But the game kept pulling me back. And I worked for 2 years for a company in Chicago, but I kept getting drawn back to hockey. And when Brian Burke was my first agent, by the way. He was my agent for 5 years. And when he took the job in Toronto, I called him and I said, I want back in. And I'd also worked as a part-time pro scout for Anaheim during my years doing other things. So I'd sort of built this resume that I'd done the different things. I'd coached and I'd scouted and I'd played. And then even being a manager, you're combining all of those things. And there's so many different ways. Like, if you told me you were unbelievable at math, and I would tell you, learn the salary cap inside out. Because there will be a day when there are 3 people managing every salary cap for every NHL team. It's that important. And and if you're going to scout, you've got to watch hockey at all levels, and you've got to learn what you're watching. And and then now, when I'm on TV or on radio or even writing a story, I choose how I want to tell that story. Do I want to tell it through the eyes of a player? Do I want to tell it through the eyes of a coach? Do I want to tell it through the eyes of a manager? Or sometimes I tell it through the eyes of a fan. And, there's a lot of different things. If you think a hockey team is a major company, that's what it is. And in any major company, a major company that makes cars, a major company that builds houses, a major company that makes refrigerators, they have all the same kind of people that work for a major company that runs a hockey team. So if you love the game and you want to stay in it, there's a way to stay in it without being directly related to hockey or being directly related to hockey. And it's just, I've been so fortunate, Mike, and so lucky to come across so many great people, but to stay in the game. And now even, the job I'm in now, I'm on the panel with Jeff O'Neill and your dad for a long time, and Darren Drager and James Duthie. and something happens in a game and I'm like, how am I going to tell this story? It's really about storytelling. And so think about yourself and your story and how you're going to tell your story.
That's awesome. Well, there's been so many great lessons in here. We thank you for your time, Dave. We appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. And yeah, like I said, so many great lessons to pull from that. But thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure, Mike. And even what you're doing here, you're taking a difficult situation and sharing. And this thing about mind and mentality, mindset and mentality, this is one of the most important things in the game. And it doesn't have anything to do with skating, but it does. And so I think you're sharing this with everyone out there is great. And if we all look at this pandemic year as a year in which we really learned one valuable lesson, then it'll be a great year.
Yeah, for sure. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Good luck with everything.
That was great. Really, really good lessons from Dave here, and a lot of carryover to what we're going to talk about. And Dave just mentioned how important the mindset and mentality piece is. And if you go through his story, there's obviously a lot of carryover, from that to where he is today. And a lot of the stuff probably wouldn't have happened in his career if he didn't have such a strong mindset and mentality. So we're going to dive right into our topic here. And a lot of this will be stuff, like I said, that Dave talked about, and there's a lot of carryover from Dave's story. So why is mindset so important? And the reason it is important in any sport, but especially hockey, when we're talking specifically about hockey, is hockey's such a hard game. Most shifts you go out there and nothing happens. You put things like injuries into the mix, you put things like slumps into the mix, and most of the time, you're going home at the end of a game, or you're going back to the bench and you're thinking to yourself, well, nothing really happened, or something negative happened. You let in a bad goal if you're a goalie. You turned over a puck if you're a defenseman. So there's a lot of failure in hockey. And I think that's one of the reasons why mindset is so important. The best players in the world struggle still, and that means everyone on this call is going to struggle. So if you look at guys like even the best in the world, everyone has a flaw to their game. There's no perfect hockey player. And even if you are as close to perfect as possible, you look at guys like Connor McDavid. He's still challenged right now. Yes, his on ice performance is good. He has all the attributes and skills, very few weaknesses, but everyone's going to ask him, have you won a Stanley Cup yet? And that's going to follow him around until he does. So that's a unique challenge for him. Sidney Crosby, one of the best. Injuries. Okay, he went through a number of injuries. You could go, the list goes on and on. Mario Lemieux, same thing, injuries. So it's really important that when those hurdles come up, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we get going here, that you're equipped to deal with those hurdles and you maintain your confidence. The last bullet point, confidence. A hockey player without confidence is not going to be successful. It's so important in sports in general. It's so important in life in general, but you need to be confident. And a hockey player that isn't playing confident hockey is not going to be successful, in my opinion. That leads us to our next slide here, growth mindset. And I think for me, this is probably the most important thing, an area in an athlete that an athlete can or can't have. And it's more important than your actual skill level on the ice or whatever sport you play. And for anyone that doesn't know what a growth mindset is, I'll quickly explain. You can see these heads here with little quotes in them, but a person who has a growth mindset basically continues to improve throughout their whole life, and they don't worry about failures. They embrace them. They use them as a chance to grow. And while on the other hand, people with fixed mindsets, they let failure, get in their head. They think that their ability can't be improved on. They stick to things they know, so they don't fail and they don't look stupid in front of people. And I can't stress this enough, guys. This is so important for any athlete, especially hockey players. And this is the reason why we see players in hockey and any other sport passing each other on the way up or the way down. So you see people that are late bloomers passing guys, or you see a person that was always the best player when they were, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And all of a sudden when they're 15, 16, and 17, people are starting to pass them. The chances are that person had a fixed mindset and they didn't continue to improve on their skills. And the people that are passing those people, the chances are they had a growth mindset, continue to improve, continue to put in the effort, and really embrace the challenges that were thrown their way. So I can't stress enough how important having a growth mindset is. I recently listened to a podcast and I found it really interesting. The speaker was talking about a thing called the hierarchy of a mindset. And he listed off all the following things. At the very lowest end, there was the victim. And the victim is someone we all know that basically goes through life and thinks everyone's picking on them. It's always someone else's fault, or they're getting picked on, or it's not good enough, but it's never the victim's fault. And that's a really, really bad place to be in life, but also in hockey. So that's the person that thinks the coach doesn't like me. I'd do better if the coach liked me, or whatever. Then there's the pessimist. So this is the person that always is thinking that nothing's ever good enough, nothing's going to work. That's stupid. That's not a good play. We shouldn't do that. The coach doesn't know what he's talking about. I know better. That's never going to work. Okay. And then we get up to the optimist. You can see there's a trend here. The optimist is someone that always thinks everything's going to turn out well, no matter what. They're the extreme positive person, and which is great. And it sounds great. But at the end of the day, the optimist is sometimes has too much optimism, and he thinks everything's just going to get better by itself. And he's just blindly optimistic, I guess we can call it, to the point where he doesn't take the steps to actually try to get over those hurdles and just figures, everything's going to be fine. It'll improve by itself. The next level of the hierarchy is called the realist. And this person is the person who thinks, that's just the way it is. I'm a realist. That's just the way it is. It can't be changed. Life is life, and that's just the way things are. We can't really change them. And again, there's some positives to being the realist, but there's also some negatives. And the one in red is the one where everyone should strive to be. And the person on the podcast I listened to called it the curious competitor. And what the curious competitor is a person that has the growth mindset, like we just talked about, and is always looking for new ways to improve themselves. They're curious. They're trying to constantly learn. They're constantly trying to improve themselves, but they're also a competitor, and they're competitive, and they embrace hardship. They embrace challenges, and they dive headfirst into challenges. So on one hand, always looking to get better. On the other hand, when they are faced with a challenge, they find a way to overcome it, and they don't get discouraged by it. And that's where everyone should strive to be, no matter what sport you're in, I think, is that section of the curious competitor. And that leads into another section that I added, and I'm a history major in school. So bear with me here for people that don't like history, but there's something that's called the Stockdale paradox. And what the Stockdale paradox, or who it's named after actually, is Admiral James Stockdale, who was an admiral in the Vietnam War and was captured by the other side and held hostage for 8 years. So you guys can think about how long the pandemic's been. We're coming up on close to a year once we get into mid-March. So you can think of how long the last years felt. Now take that and times it by 8, and that's how long that Admiral James Stockdale was held captive by the enemy. Not to mention he was tortured in that time. And the only way that he got through it, he said, which he did get through it, and he lived to tell the story, and he made it out alive. The way he described it was the only reason he stayed alive is because he confronted the most brutal facts of the current situation he was in, while also having an unwavering belief that it will get better. So if you look at that quote, or what the Stockdale paradox is, he's basically taking all these pieces here of the hierarchy of mindset and taking little pieces from each one and saying, you know what, I got to be optimistic that things are going to get better, and I'm going to overcome this, but I really need to be a realist and also take away, figure out here what I'm going to do to adapt and make sure, that I get through this, and how can I get through this? So I thought that was a really kind of cool story to give you an example of this kind of hierarchy of mindset and how you can blend it all together to create that approach. And I think the Stockdale paradox is a really good example of that. Confronting the most brutal truths or facts at the time, while also having a total belief that you're going to get through whatever you're going through. When we talk about mindset, guys, I truly believe that there is a way to change the way you think. I've personally done it a number of different ways throughout the last number of years. I call it on the screen. You can see it says hacking your mind. I really believe you can change the way you think and think about things that happen to you in your life, whether they're positive or negative. And one of those ways of hacking your mind is, and I'll talk about it a little later when I give our book recommendation for this week, but is embracing the roadblocks and hurdles. There's going to be things that come up that are hard for you guys, whether it's in hockey or whether it's in life or whatever sport you play. And if you don't embrace them and try to find a way through them, then you're never going anywhere, to put it bluntly. So if something's hard or painful, you can change your mindset. And usually the first thing that people think is when something's hard or painful or something goes wrong, first thing you want to do is feel sorry for yourself or complain too. And if you can change your mindset and slowly start shifting, where when challenges start coming up, you look at them and you say, okay, this isn't a good situation for me, but there's going to be a positive to this somehow. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to find a way to fix it. And every hurdle or roadblock is going to have a positive at some point. I really believe you can change the way you think and hack your own mind to embrace those roadblocks and hurdles and not complain about them, because that's the natural thing to do when something bad happens. And to get into complaining a little bit more is, I really love this this graphic on the left. I've posted it before on my social media, but I think it's awesome. And one of the rules we have with our team, and one of the principles with the Rangers, we call them Ranger rules or Ranger principles, is one of them is no complaining. And complaining is so contagious. You guys have all sat beside someone in a dressing room before, or someone at school, and it takes one person, and next thing you know, there's two people, there's three people, there's four, and away we go, and it's turned into a complaining session. So it's so contagious, and that's why we try to eliminate it as much as possible. But I just love the chart on the left where something bad happened. Can we do something about it? Yes, we can, or no, we can't. Those are your two options. And at the bottom, then let's stop complaining. So at the end of the day, there's so much that we're in control of, things like our work ethic, things like our attitude, all these different things. But there's also so many things that we're not in control of, especially in hockey. We don't control, how much our coach puts us on the ice sometimes, what our coach does, what system we play, calls the referee makes, bad luck plays, good luck plays, things like that. So it's really important, I think, to eliminate the complaining and get your mindset to a place where the first thing you do when something bad happens to you isn't complain, but it's how am I going to get around this, and what positive can I also take from this? Next thing I'm going to talk about quickly is Egoverse Confidence and how we you guys juggle that. And like I said before earlier, I think, to play any sport, especially hockey, you need to be confident in your ability. On the flip side of that, though, Dave's story was a pretty good explanation of how he managed his ego. It would have been really easy for him to get complacent, scored 2 goals in his first game, had a pretty good debut, feeling pretty good about himself, but found a way to also keep his ego in check, but also have the confidence in himself. So I think managing those two things is really important, and finding that balance between being a confident hockey player but not being a hockey player that's overconfident or his ego is getting in the way. I saw a good quote the other day. I think it was from Bryce Harper, the baseball player, that said, "You're either a player that has been humbled or you're a player that's about to be humbled." And that's the truth in sports. Like I said, even the best players go through challenges, slumps, injuries. So just when you're thinking that everything's easy and you're getting complacent, you're just waiting for something to go wrong, and it's going to come at some point. You better make sure that you're ready to deal with it. This was a slide that Dave pretty much talked about with his own story, but playing the long game, I call it, and playing an infinite game versus a finite game. And what I mean by that, when I say infinite game versus finite game, is an infinite game means you're looking to improve over a long span of time, while a finite game, you're looking at it thinking very short term. So you're thinking, I just want to, win the scoring title this season or win the championship this year, and I'll be happy with that, and that'll be good. And after that, whatever happens. And the danger in that is, going back to our last slide, is the complacency and the ego. And playing an infinite game means you're constantly improving. There's no end of the game in sight. And when I say the game, I mean, improving yourself, getting better at whatever sport you play, learning, being curious. And I think that's really important, is playing that infinite game and playing the long game, you can call it, and really focusing on developing yourself over a long period of time rather than just focusing on short-term results. Goals are obviously a great thing. I'm sure everyone on this call has had a coach or a teacher or a parent that has said, what, let's sit down and let's set some goals for this coming year. We recently just, went through New Year's, and that's a common thing for people to do, is to set different goals for the year ahead and try to accomplish those goals. You see it a lot at the start of hockey seasons, where coaches will call you in and say, what are your goals for this season? How many points do you want to get? What's your goal for improvement? And that's great. I think it's really good to have goals. But to be blunt, goals are extremely useless without a plan of action process that you're going to define and say, this is my goal. And then, creating a roadmap for, okay, that's great, this is my goal, but how am I going to get there? And I think the how is much more important than the what when you're talking about goals. And I think that's really important to remember, is setting a goal is great, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're not setting a plan in place and setting your goals along the way to reach that ultimate goal. Running your own race. Dave's story and unique story is a great example of this. Where you guys are when you're 7, 8, 9, compared to where you are when you're 12, 13, 14 to 17, 18, 19. It's constantly changing. Everyone grows at different stages. Things have a funny way of working out, and Dave's story of playing house league and ending up going on to play over 700 games in the National Hockey League is a great example of that, and running your own race, and also of not comparing yourself to others. And that's a really dangerous game, in my opinion, is sitting there in a dressing room or in a classroom and looking around and going, how do I compare to the person on the left of me or the right of me? And it's wasted time, it's wasted energy, and it's time and energy that you could be using to better yourself and stop worrying about everyone else and what other people are doing, and I know that's sometimes hard, especially now with social media. And we didn't have the social media as much when I grew up, and it was a lot easier just to kind of put your head down and focus on yourself and improving yourself. So I know that can be a challenge now with so much social media out there, but I think that's extremely important is really running your own race and not feeling like you have to compare yourself to others, because everyone does develop at different stages and phases in their life. So the talk today was about mindset and mentality, more so from a hockey and athletic standpoint, but the timing is obviously right with Bell Let's Talk coming up, that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about actual mental health in general on this call. And I think it's an extremely important topic, especially for young people now, and especially now with what's going on in the world and so many different things happening that we've never experienced before. Not just young people, but adults too, and how challenging living right now is with COVID and all the different things and restrictions that we're being forced to deal with. And it's really flipped the world upside down. So I think this is always an important topic, but I think it can be even more of an important topic with where we're at right now. And for all the younger people on the call, you see the bullet points here. Don't be ashamed to ask for help. And that's the biggest thing. If you're struggling, you need to talk to someone or ask for help. Don't be ashamed. And I can tell you, there's been numerous people that I've coached or talked to or known that are, high level athletes even that do need help. And it doesn't mean that, you're weak, or it doesn't mean that, you're not good at hockey or you're not going to make it to NHL, but it's extremely important to know that there's resources out there for people that are struggling with mental health. And for the coaches on the line, I think this is also extremely important, is that as coaches, you're creating an environment where the players feel like they can come to you. And it's not always you that can help them because, we're not psychologists. Most of us, we're not doctors, we're not specialists sometime in the field, but we can act as middlemen or conduits for getting that person the help they need and getting them to the resources. And I think that's extremely important. So everyone on the call, no matter what age you are, what level you're at, okay, if you're struggling, there's people you can talk to, there's people you can reach out to. And I would even challenge the coaches on the call or parents on the call to really give it some thought and think about it and think, how am I going to respond if a player asks me for help? And it's not hockey help. It's not, in practice, how can I do this better or that better? But it's to do with mental health and what your process is going to be when that time comes. So when that time comes, you've thought about it already. You know what the steps are that you're going to take. The resources available, and you can act smoothly and swiftly in that capacity. Just to wrap up quickly before we get into some Q&A here, if there is any questions, I have told you guys that I will give you some book recommendations each week, and I have a couple here. I was only originally going to give one out today, but I figured there would be another good one for the older people on the call, especially parents. So the first one I'll talk about briefly is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, the one in the middle. This is one of my favorite books ever. It really changed the way I think. And when I talk about, changing your mindset on obstacles and hurdles and things like that, and finding those positives out of the hurdles and things that you're going to have to overcome, whether it's in hockey or life. This is a really, really good book, really changed the way I think. And I would recommend that to anyone, no matter what age you are or level of play. On the left, actually, we'll start with the one on the right, and by Angela Duckworth, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance. Everyone tosses out the word grit a lot. You hear it in hockey a lot, whether it's on broadcasts or, articles or whatever. This player has grit. This person has grit. So this book really talks about what grit is. It defines it and goes into deeper depth of what a person with grit does, or how a person with grit behaves. And I found that book to be really good. On the left, this book's called The Teenage Brain by Francis Jensen. And this is a book I would recommend for coaches and parents. I wouldn't recommend this one for any younger athletes on the call. But I found this really useful as a coach that coaches teenage players. And I think this is more of a parenting book, to be honest, than it is an actual sports related book, but it does have some crossover to coaching teenage players. But for any parents on the call that have young kids that are going to be teenagers at some point or currently are teenagers, I couldn't recommend this book enough. It talks about a lot of different things that teenagers do and why they make the decisions they do. And in general, the teenage brain and the way it functions. So that would be my third recommendation. So those are some books. Hopefully you guys can enjoy some of those. And that will wrap up our PowerPoint and guest speaker portion of the call today. And if there is any Q&A, I'd be happy to answer them right now.
So this is Mike Zolt speaking. I'm just helping with the logistics and moderating the Q&A while we wait for any questions to come in. Mike, I think one question that might be interesting for people to hear about is when thinking about their own mindset and mentality and applying this in the future in their life, what's the importance of habits in that, and how do you see habits and mindset tying together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Habits are something we really put a focus on with our team. Habits are, it's a great question. We're going to do one whole presentation on off-ice habits, I guess you could say. So I don't want to get too much into it, but it doesn't have to be off-ice habits. They can be on-ice habits too, but the habits of how you live your life are ultimately the measure of how you're going to get better, how you're going to improve, how your mind is going to function on a day-to-day basis. And I don't think you can expect to just all of a sudden turn a switch on and off like a light and be mentally tough or do some of the things that we talked about, have a growth mindset or embrace obstacles. Like these are all things that are habits, and you really have to work on them daily, weekly, monthly. And I recently read something that in a book that talked about forming habits, and they gave the timeline of if you do something for 18 months, which is a year and a half, then that's when your habits really start to form and become automatic. So it's not just something you can do for a week or 2 weeks and it's just going to sink in, and all of a sudden, you're going to think that way or have that mindset. It's really something that's longer term, that you got to really continuously do over and over to really train yourself and train your mind to think that way.
Great. One question that came in, there's a few now. What podcasts would you recommend that talk about the journey to the NHL or the backstory of players' careers?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, to be honest, about ones that talk about backstory or players' careers. I do listen to a lot of podcasts. Not all of them are about hockey, to be honest. So I don't actually have a good answer for that question.
All right. Someone's asking if there's a preview of the topic for next week.
Next week's topic will be compete and work ethic. And we'll dive deeper into what compete and work ethic are. It's obviously terms that get kind of tossed around a lot in hockey. Compete, work hard. But we're going to break this down a little more into more detail and actually talk about what they mean and how we can look at them in different ways. We will have another guest speaker next week to join us. So we'll follow a similar format to what we did. the last couple of weeks, but it's going to be work ethic and compete next week.
Great. And so there's a few questions centered around what the Rangers do in these areas. And the questions center around both either mental health and the resources there, or also mental performance. And people are noting that both of those play a big role in performance, and especially as a coach. How do you, what things do you do, or what resources are there to help develop this within players?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing you have to do is separate mental health and well-being from mental performance and mindset, because they are similar things, but they're almost two completely different things. So, on a mental health side, like I talked about earlier, having a process for how you respond to someone, I think is important. We have a lot of great programs with our team. We have a partnership with the Waterloo Regional Police to pair every player up with a police officer as a mentor, which is, one area for them as an outlet to them that's outside of our hockey club. We recently put into place a thing called the Alumni Mentorship program that Ben Finale, actually, who was on our last call, is part of, and Jordan DeCourt. And those guys are basically, alumni of our hockey club that are mentors for our players that are going to be seen and around the dressing room, if we were playing this year, but we'll be around, be available to chat with players. And again, it's just another extension, not an extension, but an outside resource that isn't connected to, a coach or a manager. I think, no matter how approachable you are as a coach or manager or assistant coach or whatever it is, there could always be that fear to speak up to someone like that. So I think putting those outside resources in place are important. And then from a mental performance side, we have a couple different people we work with. We have a sports psychologist that works with our players if that's something they're interested in. We recently partnered with another company that does resiliency training, and again, can work with our players. And there's another outlet from a group that we work with as well that has a mental performance portion to it. So there's really a lot of different outlets for our players on both sides of those areas.
Great. And I think we have time for one last question. And we have, do you have any suggestions for players when trying to get out of a rut, or how to battle their negative mindsets if that's something they're facing?
Yeah, I think it gets back to the topic of, and what you'll read in that book, The Obstacle is the Way, is that first thought when something negative happens. Like, you need to be ready for it. Like I talked about earlier, like there's going to be times when people fail. There's going to be stumbles. There's going to be hurdles, and I think knowing that and just being aware of that is step one, because you'll be ready for it. And then step two is when those negative thoughts creep in, to really kind of sit back and, I think, take a long, hard look at it, and really take some time to yourself and think about the whole situation, and really look at, like, for me, it helps sometimes to zoom out of the situation, where in the moment you're looking at it. And to give an example of a player that, is a goal scorer, and that they're in a slump, they haven't scored for 5 games. And, inside their head, their whole world is crashing down on them, basically, because they're a goal scorer and they score goals, and they're not scoring goals, and everyone's looking at them. They feel like they're letting their team down, their coach down, they may not get scouted, whatever. And in the moment, or in that small little sample, it is a big deal to them, or it can be made a big deal. But if you take a look at it, you really zoom out and take a wider look at it, as the whole year, or your whole, if you're playing minor hockey, zoom out to your whole minor hockey career and realize that some of the stuff you're worrying about or having negative thoughts about are just such small little blips that you're going to look back on in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, and you're not even going to remember, or you're not even going to care about at that point, because they were just such small little things. And then when you look back, you're going to think, why was I so, worried about that or upset about that? So I find it really helps. And even sometimes when I'm feeling, negative thoughts creep in, or our team's lost a couple of games in a row, and it feels like the whole world's crashing down around you, is to really zoom out and get that bigger picture of things. And that kind of puts things into perspective sometimes, I feel like.
Great. All right, well, that's all for questions.
Okay, awesome. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. We will have our third session next Sunday again at the same time, it looks like, on work ethic and compete. And we will be sending out the link to register for that midweek this week. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a good week. We'll see you guys next week.